Every man at some point in his life comes face to face with a shadow, not the kind that stretches long behind him on a sunny afternoon, but the kind that follows him around inside his own head. It's a quiet whisper at first, a suggestion, a nudge. Don't try that. You'll just make a fool of yourself. Leave it alone, you're not built for that. Better to stay safe, stay put, than risk falling flat on your face. For some, that shadow grows until it's all they can see, blotting out the sun, dimming every bright idea before it even gets a chance to glow. It holds them still, keeps them small, and convinces them that the comfort of what they know is far more valuable than the scary unknown. It's a clever beast, that shadow, because it pretends it's protecting you when all it's really doing is stealing your chances. There was a man, and his name was Hank. 42 years old, the kind of age where you start noticing the faint creaks in your own frame, the way mornings don't spring back quite as easily as they used to. He wasn't a man who made much noise in the world. You wouldn't hear his name shouted from the rooftops, or see his face plastered on a billboard. Hank was one of the many silent gears in the engine of everyday life, a factory worker through and through. You'd see him coming out of the assembly plant just past 3 o'clock, his lunch pail clutched in one hand, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. His work boots, steel-toed and scuffed, carried the weight of 1,000 shifts, each one a mirror of the last. His uniform, a sturdy, faded blue that had seen its share of oil stains and sweat, hung on him like a second skin, a testament to the repetitive, honest grind of his days. Hank's face wasn't lined with laughter, but with the quiet etchings of years spent under fluorescent lights, squinting at schematics and fixing what broke. His jaw often seemed set, not in anger, but in a kind of permanent contemplation, as if he was always working through some silent calculation. His hands, though, were what told the real story. They were wide and strong, the knuckles thick, the palms calloused from years of gripping wrenches and hoisting heavy components. These were hands that knew how to build, how to fix, how to provide. But they were also hands that had, for too long, held back. His eyes, a muted blue, were usually a little tired around the edges. They'd seen the same production line churn out the same parts for 20 years. They held a quiet weariness that some mistook for indifference, a stoicism that kept people from looking too close. But if you caught him in an unguarded moment, maybe watching a bird on a power line or staring off into the distance during his 15-minute break, you might glimpse a flicker of something else in those eyes, a hint of longing, a shadow of what might have been, quickly shuddered away like a forgotten memory. He carried himself with a quiet dependability, a man who showed up, did his job, and kept his thoughts mostly to himself. He was, to the world, a solid, unremarkable pillar of his community, just another brick in the wall. But inside that quiet man, the shadow was always busy, always whispering its old, familiar song. The digital numbers on the alarm clock glowed a brutal red. 5:00 a.m. A low groan escaped Hank's throat, swallowed quickly by the pre-dawn quiet of his modest, well-maintained house on the outskirts of town. It was the same groan he'd made for 20 years, the universal language of a working man dragged from the fleeting peace of sleep. He swung his feet to the cool linoleum, the familiar ache in his lower back a constant companion, a ghost of 1,000 lifts and bends on the factory floor. The ritual was ingrained, a kind of waking meditation. Coffee brewing, the rich, bitter smell filling the kitchen. A piece of toast, eaten standing by the sink, listening to the muffled snores of Brenda from their bedroom and the softer, adolescent breathing of Mark and Lily down the hall. Their world was still dark, still safe in dreams, and Hank was the silent sentinel, stepping out into the gray-blue pre-dawn to keep it that way. He'd check the locks, adjust the thermostat, a silent tour of the home he worked so hard to keep afloat. Every loose shingle was nailed down, every weed pulled from the small flower beds Brenda tended. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs, a fortress against the unpredictable world. His drive to the plant was a blur of familiar streetlights and the slow creep of dawn painting the sky in pale pastels he rarely noticed. By 5:45 a.m., he was punching in, the old-time clock clanging its rhythmic, unfeeling beat. The factory floor was already alive with the low thrum of machinery, the metallic tang of oil and coolant, the shouted greetings of men whose faces were as familiar as his own. For 8 hours, Hank became part of the machine, a cog in a larger, relentless mechanism. He moved steel plates, operated the hydraulic press, checked gauges, tightened bolts. Repetitive, precise work that paid the bills but left his mind free to wander, though it rarely did anything but circle the same worn paths. He was good at it, dependable. He rarely made mistakes. But the monotony was a quiet kind of torture, a slow sanding down of the soul. The dollars earned meant groceries on the table, a roof over their heads, Mark's college fund slowly growing, Lily's braces paid for. But the bills didn't care about his dreams. They just piled up, demanding payment, anchoring him to the known, the safe, the predictable. There wasn't much left for anything else after that. And that was the quiet horror of it, the constant hum beneath the surface of his stoic exterior. For years, there had been another Hank, a younger, brighter version who dreamt of sawdust and wood glue, of chisels and smooth, finished planks. He'd seen himself carving intricate designs, building sturdy furniture, creating something beautiful and tangible with those capable hands of his. There was a corner in his garage, cluttered with forgotten tools, a half-sanded plank of oak gathering dust, a testament to a passion he'd never truly allowed himself to pursue. Every time the thought would resurface, a flicker of desire, it was immediately met by a cold, cutting voice in his own head. "What makes you think you can do that, Hank?" It would sneer. "You'll just make a mess. You're not smart enough for that kind of intricate work. You'll waste time, waste money, and just end up with a pile of firewood." He'd hear it echo, a familiar, cruel chorus. "You're just a factory worker, Hank. Stick to what you know. You're not that kind of guy." This inner critic, insidious and persistent, had held him captive for decades. It wasn't loud, not a shout, but a whisper, relentless, always there, subtly diverting him from any path that felt too risky, too ambitious, too new. It painted vivid pictures of failure. Shattered wood, mangled projects, the disappointment in Brenda's eyes, the quiet judgment of others. It was a fear of failure so profound it manifested as a crushing perfectionism that paralyzed him. Better not to try and fail than to try and know for sure you weren't good enough. So he stayed in his comfort zone, convinced he wasn't capable of more, letting opportunities pass him by without ever truly trying. He saw the man he was, reliable and weary, and the ghost of the man he'd once hoped to be, standing miles apart, separated by an invisible wall of self-doubt, built brick by brick with every whispered lie. That invisible wall had stood for so long, impenetrable, seemingly permanent. But sometimes, a wall isn't brought down by a battering ram, but by a quiet, insistent tremor, a small crack that runs deeper than anyone expects. For Hank, that tremor started not within him, but with his son, Mark. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those rare autumn days where the air was crisp but the sun still had some warmth, pulling neighbors out for yard work. Hank was in the garage, half-heartedly tidying, mostly just moving things from one side to the other. Mark, though, was in his element. Spread across the workbench, amidst glue bottles and tiny tools, sat the ambitious skeleton of his latest model rocket. He'd been obsessed with them for months, devouring books, watching videos, his face alight with a focused energy Hank rarely saw in himself anymore. Today was launch day for a previous build. Hank watched as Mark, his brow furrowed in concentration, carefully carried the sleek metallic cylinder outside. Brenda and Lily stood on the porch, a small, expectant audience. With a countdown that was more practiced ritual than actual necessity, Mark pressed the launch button. A hiss, a pop, a plume of smoke, and the rocket shot skyward, a silver needle against the pale blue. It climbed, it soared, it hung for a moment at its apex, then veered wildly, spiraled, and plummeted into Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias with a disheartening thud. Mark's shoulders slumped. He walked over, retrieved the slightly bent rocket, his face a mask of disappointment. "It always does that," he mumbled, kicking at a loose pebble. "The parachute never deploys right." "Try again, buddy," Hank called out, his own voice sounding a little hollow. "You'll figure it out." The next few weeks saw a repeat performance. Another rocket, meticulously built, launched with renewed hope, met with another inglorious crash. Then another. Each failure chipped away at Mark's spirit, a little piece of light going out with every crumpled nose cone. Hank saw it, recognized it with a terrible clarity. The way Mark would pick at the glue on his fingers, staring blankly at the instructions. The slow, defeated sigh. Then came the day. Hank was in the garage again, trying to fix a leaky faucet, a task he'd put off for weeks. Mark was there too, but not working. He was simply staring at his current project on the bench, a half-finished rocket, its intricate wiring exposed, its fins not yet attached. There was no joy in his eyes, just a vacant, tired look. "Trouble, son?" Hank asked, his voice softer than he intended. Mark shrugged, a gesture of profound weariness. "It's pointless, Dad. I've tried everything. I've reread the instructions a dozen times, watched all the videos. It just doesn't work. I just don't get it." He picked up a half-empty tube of epoxy, twisting the cap, then he grabbed the partially assembled rocket. Without a word, he started to move towards the trash can, a grim finality in his movements. "What are you doing?" Hank asked, the words catching in his throat. Mark looked up, his face etched with a despair that was startlingly familiar. "Giving up," he said, his voice flat. "What's the point in trying if I'm just gonna mess it up again? I'm not smart enough for this, I guess. I'm just not that kind of guy." The last words hit Hank like a physical blow. "I'm just not that kind of guy." It was the precise phrase his own inner critic had whispered to him 1,000 times, silencing his desires, dismissing his aspirations. He saw himself, younger, full of quiet dreams, standing right there in Mark's place. He saw all the moments he'd stopped short, all the passions he'd let wither, all the chances he'd let slip by because that insidious voice told him he wasn't good enough. And now it was echoed in his son's young, defeated voice. A cold dread seeped into Hank's bones. He'd built that wall of self-doubt in his own mind, brick by brick. Was he now watching his son build the exact same prison for himself? Was he passing on this crippling inheritance, not through words, but through silent example? Mark wasn't just giving up on a rocket. He was giving up on the idea of himself as someone capable of figuring things out, of overcoming challenges, of pursuing a passion even when it was hard. He was giving up on trying. And Hank, quiet, stoic, fearful Hank, had shown him how. That night's sleep was a distant country, a peaceful land Hank couldn't reach. He lay in bed, the familiar weight of Brenda's arm across him, the steady rhythm of her breathing, but he felt utterly alone. The clock on the bedside table glowed 3:17 a.m., then 3:28. Each tick was a hammer blow, marking the passage of time, the slipping away of opportunities. He finally eased himself out of bed, careful not to wake Brenda, and padded silently to the kitchen. The house was a dark, silent cavern, holding secrets and regrets. He poured himself a glass of water, but didn't drink. He just stood at the window, staring out at the inky blackness, a faint orange glow from the distant factory lights painting the sky. Mark's face floated before him. The crumpled brow, the defeated slump of his shoulders, the flat, resigned tone in his voice. "I'm just not that kind of guy." The words echoed in the quiet kitchen, not from Mark, but from Hank's own past, from 1,000 internal conversations he'd never won. What had his life become? A cycle. Wake, work, bills, sleep. Rinse, repeat. He was dependable, yes. He provided for his family, he knew that much. But at what cost? He looked around the modest, well-maintained kitchen, the home they had built, the life they had created. It was good, it was stable, it was safe. But a cold, hard truth began to chisel its way through his carefully constructed defenses. Safe was also small. Safe was also static. Safe was also the absence of genuine growth, of challenging himself, of knowing what he was truly capable of. He remembered the dusty oak plank in the garage, the half-finished woodworking project mocking him from its forgotten corner. The desire to create, to build with his own hands, to bring something beautiful and useful into the world. It was still there, a faint spark under layers of ash. But the voice had always been louder, stronger. "You'll just screw it up. Don't waste the money. You don't have the talent." He hadn't just let opportunities pass him by. He had actively pushed them away, convinced by an invisible tormentor that he was unworthy. He had allowed himself to be a prisoner, bound by chains of his own making, forged from fear and polished by an insistence on impossible perfection. And in doing so, he had inadvertently drawn the blueprints for his son's own cage. A raw, unfamiliar shame burned through him. How could he tell Mark to keep trying, to not give up, when he himself had become the living embodiment of giving up? What kind of example was that? He had always thought he was protecting his family by being practical, by being steady, by not taking risks. But what if, in his practicality, he had robbed them and himself of something far more valuable? The courage to pursue the impossible, the joy of creation, the sheer, stubborn defiance of trying something simply because you wanted to. The night pressed in, heavy and unforgiving. He felt the full weight of his years, not just the physical weariness from the factory floor, but the spiritual weariness of a life lived cautiously, always holding back. The ghost of the man he'd wanted to be stood closer now, not miles away, but right beside him in the dark kitchen, a silent, disapproving observer. And for the first time, Hank couldn't look away. He finally admitted, in the stark, unforgiving silence of 3:00 a.m., that the little voice in his head, the one that told him he wasn't good enough, wasn't trying to protect him at all. It was just scared. And it had made him scared too, for decades. That night, the ghosts of regret and what-ifs finally pinned him down. The silence of 3:00 a.m. had a way of stripping away all the comfortable lies, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. And the truth was he'd been wrong, terribly wrong. The little voice hadn't been a guardian, it had been a warden meticulously building the walls of his own prison, brick by invisible brick. "Enough," he whispered, the word barely a breath in the vast, still darkness of his kitchen. It wasn't a roar of defiance or a dramatic declaration. It was just a quiet, exhausted settling. A line in the sand, unseen but absolute. He didn't know what enough meant, not exactly. Didn't know what he was going to do or how. He just knew with a certainty that hummed deep in his bones that he couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep letting that fear-riddled voice dictate his life, not anymore. Not when he saw it reaching for Mark, trying to pull his son into the same quiet despair. The thought of Mark inheriting his father's self-made cage was a gut punch. This stopped with him. It had to. The next morning, the alarm shrieked its usual summons at 5:00 a.m., but something felt different. The weariness was still there, a familiar ache in his shoulders and a dull throb behind his eyes. But underneath it, like a stubborn seedling pushing through concrete, was a sliver of resolve, a tiny, defiant ember. The old voice, the critic, was still there, of course. "What was all that nonsense last night, Hank? You're a factory man, always have been, always will be. Don't go getting ideas." It tried to slide back into his ear, smooth as oil, but this time he heard it differently. He heard the fear in its voice, not his own. He worked his shift at the plant, the same rhythmic clank and whir, the same endless stream of components passing under his hands. But his mind wasn't entirely lost in the drone. It was planning. A dull, almost forgotten itch to do something. He thought about the loose step on the back porch, the one that had been groaning underfoot for months, a hazard Brenda had mentioned more times than he could count. He'd always meant to get to it. "Soon," he'd say, "or I'll get some new lumber next paycheck." Excuses, he now realized, for the voice telling him he'd only make it worse, he'd measure wrong, he'd botch it up. He punched out, got in his truck, the setting sun painting the sky in a bruised purple. He drove home, the thought of that step pressing on him. Dinner was quiet, the usual family chatter, a low hum in the background. After the dishes were done, Brenda settled onto the couch with her book, and Mark and Lily disappeared into their rooms. Hank, instead of collapsing into his worn armchair, stood for a moment in the middle of the living room, feeling the pull of the couch, the comfort of routine. "Just sit down, Hank," the voice whispered, its tone insidious, familiar. "You're tired." "You've earned it. The step can wait another day. It's not going anywhere." He closed his eyes, hearing the old familiar tune, but for the first time he saw the puppeteer pulling the strings. "It's just scared," he remembered thinking at 3 a.m. "And it's making me scared, too." He took a deep breath, tasting the dust of decades of deferred dreams. He walked out the back door, not to the armchair, but to the small, rusty shed at the corner of the yard. The padlock was stiff, the key hesitant in his hand. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten projects. Cobwebs draped across neglected tools. He grabbed his old toolbox, heavier than he remembered, the metal cold and pitted with rust. The saw lay dusty on a shelf, its teeth dull, the tape measure, its edges nicked. "You're going to look like an idiot," the voice chirped, a little louder now, a little more desperate. "You don't even have the right wood." "What are you even doing?" Hank ignored it. He lifted the wobbly step, testing its give. It was rotted through underneath. He needed to pry it off, cut a new piece of treated lumber, resecure it. It felt daunting. His hands, usually so confident with a wrench on the factory floor, felt clumsy with the claw hammer. He knew just enough to be dangerous, the voice crowed. He paused, hammer in hand, a tremor of the old paralysis threatening to grip him. His mind flashed to Mark's crestfallen face, the crumpled remains of the rocket in his hand. "Just start," he thought. "You don't gotta be perfect, you just gotta be willing to try." With a grunt, he wedged the claw under the edge of the first loose plank. The wood groaned, protesting. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be pretty, but he was doing it. He was finally, stubbornly just starting. The claw hammer bit into the rotted wood with a splintering groan. Dust and flakes of old paint rained down as Hank wrestled with the ancient planks. His hands, accustomed to the smooth, cool steel of factory machinery, felt awkward and stiff, unused to the brute force required for demolition. The first plank came free with a reluctant sigh, revealing a dark, damp void underneath, home to a scattering of spider webs and the skeletal remains of forgotten insects. "Look at this mess," the voice whispered, a smug tone now, and "I told you so. You're just making it worse. You don't know what you're doing." Hank wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a hand, ignoring the tremor in his grip. He pushed on, slowly, methodically. Each nail pulled, each piece of decaying wood pried away, was a small, grunting victory against the decay and against the doubt. He worked until the sun dipped below the neighbor's roof, casting long shadows that made the half-demolished steps look even more forlorn. That night his shoulders ached and his fingers throbbed. Brenda gave him a questioning look when he came in, smelling of dirt and old wood, but said nothing. He found a piece of scratch paper and sketched a rough diagram, trying to figure out how to cut the support beams. He realized he needed a new saw blade, better screws, and definitely some treated lumber. The budget, already stretched thin, groaned under the thought. Day 3 found Hank back at it after a quick stop at the hardware store. The new saw blade bit cleaner, but cutting the angles for the stringers was a nightmare. He measured twice, cut once, and still the piece was a hair too short. He stared at it, the wood lying mockingly on the grass. "See," the voice crowed, practically cackling. "Waste of money, waste of time. You're just not cut out for this, Hank. You never were." A wave of the familiar despair washed over him, thick and cold. His stomach clenched. It was so much easier to just leave things broken, wasn't it? To let them stay as they were, imperfect but predictable. He looked at the half-torn steps, a gaping wound in the side of his house, and the discarded piece of wood, a testament to his incompetence. It was too much. He wanted to throw the saw down, walk back inside, and never look at it again. Just like he'd walked away from the old guitar, the half-written stories, the countless what-ifs of his life. Then a flicker. Not a memory, not exactly, but a feeling. The heavy weight of Mark's sadness, the slump of his son's shoulders as he gave up. This was how it started. This feeling right here, the moment you looked at a setback and let it define you. Hank took a ragged breath. "All right," he muttered, not to the voice, but to himself. "All right." He picked up the too short piece of wood. It couldn't be used for this step, but maybe it could be used somewhere else for a brace or a shim. It wasn't a total loss. He would buy another piece of lumber. It meant another trip, more money, but quitting meant more than just the steps staying broken. He went back to the store, heavier in his step, but with a different kind of resolve. He bought a new length of treated lumber, and this time he asked the old man behind the counter for advice on cutting angles. The man, a grizzled, retired carpenter, gave him a few pointers, drawing quick diagrams on a scrap of paper. Hank listened, truly listened, the advice a balm against the nagging self-doubt. Day 7. The steps were slowly, painfully taking shape. His back ached with a dull, persistent throb that even a hot shower couldn't quite loosen. His hands were calloused, a few splinters embedded stubbornly under the skin. He'd learned to slow down, to double-check, to accept that mistakes would happen. He de-stripped a screw, drilled a pilot hole slightly off-center, and once almost dropped a heavy timber on his foot. Each time the inner critic had roared triumphant. Each time Hank had ignored it, or at least found a way to work around it. He wasn't perfect, far from it. The new steps weren't furniture-grade craftsmanship. There were still gaps, slightly uneven cuts, screw heads that weren't perfectly flush, but they were sturdy, solid, they didn't wobble anymore. He found himself thinking, good enough for now, a revolutionary thought for a man who used to demand perfection from himself, and then abandon the task when he inevitably fell short. Brenda came out with 2 glasses of iced tea late one afternoon. "Looking good, Hank?" she said, her voice soft, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Really coming along?" He just grunted, taking a long drink, but inside something settled. A quiet hum of satisfaction that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with persistence. The battle wasn't over. The voice still piped up, offering its unsolicited judgments, but it sounded different, less like an angry drill sergeant, more like a nervous bystander. He was still tired, so very tired, but it was a different kind of tired. A tired earned by pushing through, by refusing to give in. And for the first time in a long time, the weariness didn't feel quite so quiet or indifferent. It felt like progress. He stood back, wiping sweat from his brow, his hands sore but steady. They weren't perfect, not by a long shot, but they were his. He'd built them. He'd seen the project through, from broken wood to something solid and true. A quiet, unfamiliar pride settled in his chest, thawing the long-frozen fear he'd carried. Brenda noticed it first. She saw him not just doing the work, but engaged in it, a flicker in his eyes that had been absent for years. One evening after the kids were asleep, she found him sketching designs on an old notepad, shapes that looked like furniture. He hadn't touched those carpenter pencils in over a decade. "What's that, hun?" she asked gently. He just shrugged, a small, shy smile playing on his lips. "Just an idea for a small table." It wasn't just the steps anymore.